Great. Secretary Clauser, would you like to say some words? I'm happy to walk through the agenda, but if you want to kick us off, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, David. Welcome, everyone. I should say welcome back. I think this is the first full meeting we have had since the summer hiatus. So happy to be back with everyone. And David, I know we have quite a few things on the agenda today.
Yeah.
So why don't we get started?
Super. Okay, great. If Jane or Marion or somebody could drop in the chat the usual links to the agenda and all the documents that we're going to need today. Let me just walk through it quickly before we dive into it. We have our usual approval of previous minutes. Then we'll have Peter Walk in his role at the Efficiency Vermont talking about flooding response to support cleaner heating systems for low-income Vermonters. We'll do that as our just transition reflection this morning. Then we get into the meat of the meeting. We've got a couple big things to look at. One are the revised biomass recommendations that are coming out of that counselor writing group. And we want to have a big conversation about that. We do not need to make a decision about this today. We need to provide some detailed feedback and figure out how we're doing and what needs to happen between now and your next council meeting when you will make a decision on these. But it's important for us to dive in. We've scheduled public comment sort of in the middle of that, around 12:10, and then we expect to come back and finish up our conversation around biomass after that public comment. We'll take a break. We come back and have two more process-oriented issues as opposed to the substance-oriented biomass issue. We've got a work planning sort of real, initial sketch kind of document that we want to get your feedback on. The steering committee wants your feedback on. And then we've got a new governance document that's an update from our previous one that really tries to be a look-forward document about the role of the council going forward and pick up a lot of the issues that councilors you all have talked about since March. This document we are going to attempt to approve today as a process document. We're going to try to do this today. The steering committee's worked hard on this. And we'll do a final round of public comment and finish up. And we're taking a little more time than usual today because of the amount of work. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. And before we dive in, any quick questions, friendly amendments, or other for the agenda today? Any concerns around this? Okay, great. And I'll just remind folks, we're all here on Zoom together today. We do these meetings as Zoom meetings, not Zoom webinars, which means we rely on everyone doing their best Zoom etiquette. Thanks for that. I know we're good at it. One of the things we like to do for the council meetings like this is we ask counselors, if you're in a place to have your camera on, it's great if you can have your camera on for the conversations. We ask the members of the public and others who are observing today to keep your cameras off until we do public comment periods. And that's a way of helping just to keep the screen cleaner for the council conversations. Okay. All right, so let's dive in. First things first, we have minutes to approve. June 12th minutes. Does anybody need a moment to look through those? They're clickable through the agenda link. I will note that I have noticed that these minutes don't actually list the participants in the meeting, the council participants. And so we're going to need to update these with that list. I just noticed that preparing for today's meeting.
I was about to ask that question.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So we will be updating the minutes with the who was there, with the record of who was there. Are there other issues or concerns people would like to bring up around these minutes? Okay. Unless I hear a request for more time, let's treat those minutes as approved with the caveat that they need the list of participants. Okay, great. So let's move in. Peter Walk, are you here? Let me see. Huh. Jane, do you see Peter?
I don't, but I told him 11 based on the agenda.
Oh, so we're 2 minutes early on him? Okay.
It's early. Never
Okay.
get ahead of council.
All right. Well,
I can text
I would
him.
say if that's the case, I just want to make sure then, counselors, if you've got your setup there so that you have both of, or all three of the big documents we're already working on today, the revised biomass recommendations, the counselor work planning document, and then the governance document. It will be helpful if you have all three of those handy today. And let me know if anybody's having a hard time accessing them. They're in your email and also linked on the agenda. Members of the public, also, all these documents are linked on the agenda. So I'd invite you to click into those as we're going today. I will also, we don't see each other very often as counselors. So if folks want to do any updates, climate counselors that you'd like to share with your fellow counselors, this is a perfect, we can use the next 60 seconds to do that. Jane, do you have an update?
I saw Peter had joined, but happy
great.
to tell 60 seconds too.
Okay. Any updates, counselors, for each other? Things you want to make sure you hear about? Anything you'd like to share? Okay. Great. All right. So, Peter, are you here? Peter Walk? There you are.
I am, David. How are you?
I'm great. It's good to see you. So I was going to pass over to you and give you a little time to talk about what's going on with the response, the flooding response, in particular around low-income Vermonters. I don't know, Peter, if you were planning on sharing anything on your screen or if just talking for a little bit.
Nope. I was going to talk for a little bit, and then I'll drop some links in the chat at the end. Appreciate this invite. It's nice to be with all you again. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you all in a while. I wanted to start with more of a sort of personal standpoint. As many of you know, I live in Montpelier. I spent the week following the immediate aftermath of the flood, helping to organize volunteers in town to try to make sure that there were resources available for people to clean up and do whatever was needed in the aftermath. I saw lots of opportunities for us to think about the systems that support people and how that can work better into the future. And that has played out into the aftermath of sort of what is the role of different levels of government, of nonprofit support and other things, and helping to make sure people have the resources and those kind of technical and just sort of bandwidth support that they need. I think it's great that part of the FEMA public assistance process is to provide some amount of case management support for folks struggling. What we saw in this flood was every community, so many different communities across the state impacted in different ways, which led to different types of needed responses. But that level of sort of case management support for the individual who has no idea where to get started, no idea how to access the various resources that are available to them, would be incredibly valuable early on, and something I would want the sort of state to think about and willing to be a part of. Obviously, kind of brainstorming what that looks like now, so that there's planning in place for folks who need it. As we saw in the sort of immediate aftermath, FEMA takes a little while to arrive, right? That's part of their process, right? It has to get in that disaster declaration, and then there's time. That time, there is no delay in that timing for the individuals involved. And so they are, working to figure out what they can do in the immediate aftermath. And there's good information and there's bad information flowing around, and helping to fill that void and lead in that moment is a real opportunity. Immediately sort of following that, for those who don't know where I'm now at Efficiency Vermont. We had great conversations with our regulators at the Department of Public Service and other stakeholders in the energy space to understand was there an opportunity to help folks, get heat and hot water for the coming winter, and two, if there were opportunities to either supplement with more efficient technology or create opportunities to transition folks at the moment where they had lost equipment or needed to have significant repairs to existing heating and cooling equipment and other appliances. So that was sort of what's prompted that conversation. It led to an emergency board action on July 31st, and working with the Department of Public Service to stand up a grant program very quickly, and to launch programs. Those programs launched for residential customers on the 5th of September. We've been calling this a launch and learn process because everything is pretty custom and unique about everybody's different situations, and how insurance has supported them and how FEMA has supported them, and making sure that we can both be good stewards of state dollars and to make sure that the folks who need the help are getting the help they need. So we have sort of two primary programs at this point, or three primary programs at this point. One is for residential customers. This is for low and moderate income customers up to 120% of AMI to get support for heating systems, hot water, and other appliances that might have been impacted. The second program is using a small amount of unspent energy efficiency charge dollars to support businesses who need help replacing key pieces of equipment. That is up to $1,000 per piece of equipment, up to 4 pieces of equipment. So I should say the residential pieces, the legislature capped at $10,000 per housing unit, and then the third program really is focused on rental property owners and helping fill that sort of renter need, and understanding what opportunities there are to help folks make transitions both for their tenants and within the housing stock over time. And then in working through the grant agreement with the Public Service Department, we had further conversations and ended up adding a couple of pieces that will extend beyond the flood, that are also ARPA dollars for heat pump hot water heater switch and save programs. So that's covers up to the full cost of switching over to a heat pump hot water heater, and then also electric panel upgrade dollars. Both of those will flow both through EBT, well, sort of from EBT, and also through to other parties who are will be partners in implementing those pieces. So all of that came together fast, but those are really standard ARPA dollars, so they will extend through 2026. The flooding dollars are really focused on the immediate aftermath. And those flood dollars primarily came from $10 million of repurposed ARPA weatherization money, and are going to repurpose to support immediate flood response. So that's the sort of basic program rundown. I'll drop some links into the chat for folks to be able to explore further. We are really trying to get the word out. We understand that people are at different places on the journey of recovery, and so some may have made purchases already. Those we were able to make those retroactive, all the grants retroactive to be when the flooding occurred. So if you bought something in the immediate aftermath of the flooding to get yourself ready for for winter, and it's a qualifying piece of equipment, then it will be eligible for dollars. We are also working under the sort of FEMA first mantra, trying to get folks as much help as they can before they come seek support from us, because that way they can maximize whatever dollars are they're eligible for. But we do understand that is a complicated and hard process, and are willing to help folks who opt out or don't want to see some piece of it to fruition. I will also add that while the individuals working for FEMA have been nothing but superheroes in Vermont, they've been wonderful to work with. The system is about as inaccessible as I could possibly imagine, specifically for the part around replacing your personal property, which starts with applying for a SBA loan and being denied that because you're not income qualified, and then being eligible for more grant assistance from FEMA. There are some things about the system that are broken and designed to, or that make it really hard for folks to access. So as we think about making our systems more effective and more accessible for folks moving forward, that's an example to me of where we have some work to do.
Thanks, Peter. So we have a little, excuse me, we have some time here if counselors have some questions for what Peter described. And so I just open it up for counselors if any questions you have or feedback you have on Peter's, what he's talked about and all the hard work going on. Richard?
Well, first, thanks, Peter, and thanks to Efficiency Vermont for the good and quick work, and to you personally for your work in Montpelier. A couple of questions. Can you give us an idea of the numbers of households that you think you either have provided services to or are likely to provide services to under the programs you're describing? That's question one. And question two, we have to acknowledge that this is an emergency, and as you said, getting people through the coming winter is essential. Nevertheless, I wonder the degree to which it's possible that you've been able to leverage or expect to be able to leverage these repairs to get people into cleaner heating appliances and panel upgrades that would make it possible to do the right thing in the future for cleaner appliances.
Sure. Part of the challenge is a timing question, Richard. I appreciate your question. There are a number of factors at play that we've been trying to work through as we've been thinking about this, because I think that was the sort of the original intent of the conversation was, is there an opportunity to help people transition to the technology that we'd like to see them transition to over the course of time? The reality is one of timing, where if but based on the timing of the flooding and the time it takes to launch programs and get approval and create grant agreements and all those things that are required, people have made choices, right? And made choices already. They may have needed to make choices that were similar to their existing technology for FEMA support, for insurability, for the requirements of their mortgage, that require a consistent central heating system in place in many instances. It's not a requirement for all, but it is certainly something that we see a lot of in those sorts of requirements. And so we have both opportunities for people to replace their existing systems and to supplement with other technology to be able to make something better. And the technology that they are replacing things with is Energy Star certified, and at least will be more efficient than what they likely had previously. But there isn't a great answer here without, the sort of somebody having showed up with, design, technical experts and installers and everything else all at one point to be able to do that, and to be able to convince insurance companies that a well-designed heat pump system, for example, is a central heating system, right? Paula, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me all right?
Ken?
Yeah, okay. I think I heard you say that you're looking for help sort of getting the word out. And so I'm just wondering if there's a specific way to do that. Like, what are you already doing and what gaps need to be filled?
Yeah, we have been doing any number of things. We're doing direct mailers to customers impacted. We're doing utility bill inserts. We're doing, our normal sort of TV and radio and other ads. We've done partner webinars for folks. We've done direct webinars to impact the impacted public. We are trying to get as much information out there as possible. We know that people are relying on trusted parties to help them through this process, whether that be different community nonprofits or just, sort of groups that have come together to provide that support. And so we've really been focusing there to try to get that information to folks as they're acting as kind of unofficial case managers for many of the folks in this situation. And so whatever we can do to sort of help those messages get out. To Richard, I didn't end up really answering your question before, though, to go about numbers. Sorry. What we know from the FEMA data is that 500 people had repair or replace heating system, tickets through the FEMA process, and another 300 had a sort of further evaluation kind of house call process that could lead to more. So that's just for heating equipment. We don't know how many of those will come. We expect the numbers as marketing and other things kick up to get bigger, but they've been relatively modest to date so far. So sorry to not answer that part of your question.
That's fine. And Paula, do you have other ideas that you want to share right now on the outreach component in addition to what Peter described of what's happening?
Yeah, I don't think so. I was just curious because it would be interesting a little bit, I guess, to understand what the barriers are to people. Is it a matter of like not having the information or not trusting? I don't know, but it seems like a big problem to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are nothing but barriers, to be honest, and the sort of standard challenge of trying to get let folks know that there's help available, how to access it, how to feel like they're sort of working with trusted partners. All those pieces exist. There's an upfront capital component as well, right? People are getting some amount of support from FEMA if they've applied and are in a corresponding county, but that isn't enough to cover all of their damage period, let alone sort of have that upfront capital. So we are working with there's a couple of different paths that folks can go down. We can reimburse contractors directly as one option. And then we're also working with our traditional lending partners to see if there can be a sort of an easy access upfront capital loan that we could then pay the lender directly. And so very little user input needed for the folks involved. But the upfront capital piece is definitely going to be an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. So do you have any materials or a link to a way for people to donate to a fund, or is that just, I'd be interested if you have like marketing materials that I could help distribute or something like that.
Sure. I can send those along to David and Jane and have them share all those pieces with all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Joey, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for all the work you and your team are doing in this moment. It's really important. My question is, are you running into any workforce or supply chain issues or Do you anticipate that if and as hoped for, this would be as successful as possible as another potential barrier?
Yeah, I mean, we that was one of the first things we started querying early on, was talking to supply chain partners and finding out sort of whether or not there was capacity in the system, and working with contractors to understand whether they had capacity or not. One of the things that I want to give the administration shout out for that was issued last week was a sort of survey that was going out to folks who had submitted FEMA claims to kind of check in to see where they were in their journey. Have they found a contractor? Is that contractor available to do the work? Where are you in that process so that we can do some more fine-tuned response efforts there? So that will be really helpful data to get in. So I encourage anybody who is listening to this who got one of those surveys to please fill it out so that the state can have that kind of information at hand. We know that the workforce was constrained before the flood. A lot of contractors have pivoted and shifted their work to be solely flood focused or highly flood focused right afterwards. So what the impact that's having on other projects that may be waiting, it's hard to know, and whether or not whether we're going to have enough people to install heating technology before winter. As I wake up on this kind of frosty, like cool morning, thinking the winter is coming. We don't have great information because it's a pretty fluid situation. So hopefully that survey will help provide more info.
Okay. Anything else before we wrap up here on this topic? Okay. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for coming in and sharing that.
Happy to join.
Excellent. There are links in the chat. I saw, Peter, thanks for dropping that link in the chat.
And I'll send a sort of full email with stuff through Jane for all of you to take a look at.
Great. Super. Okay, thanks. All right, so let's move into our first substantive conversation today. It's around the revised biomass recommendations. I'm going to throw up a slide quickly that just shows the process of how this document came about. Then I'm going to invite some of the counselors that were involved in this writing group to speak a little bit about the process and sort of the things that were going through their minds as trying to address the concerns that were raised by the council. Then we're going to do sort of round of questions and Q&A from the rest of you counselors. And finally, if there's specific opportunities to make improvements to this document, let's try to capture those, and I'll be taking some notes and share those notes back as we go. So let me start here. Hang on just one sec. To say, this is the basic process here. You'll remember we spoke about this in the June meeting. The four folks who volunteered to do this were Bram, David, Julie, and Kelly. They met 3 times. And their task was to incorporate the comments and concerns that you all had raised as a council into a revised document so that you all can review it today and then make a decision on it at your next meeting. Right. So this was the super basics of what happened over the summer to get to the document that you see in your meeting materials. So why don't I just turn it over to Bram, David, Julie, and Kelly for some initial reflections about what this document reflects or what it's trying to do. And then let's open it up to Q&A. And I'm happy to pull up the document at any moment if you want to go into a specific section of it. But in no particular order, Kelly, Bram, David, Julie, any quick reflections sort of to tee up this conversation so that counselors get a flavor of how your conversations went. I'm happy to do this just on the basis of who's on my screen. Bram's at the top of my screen, so Bram, I'll go to you first, and then others feel free to jump in.
Sure. So, as you will recall, the biomass task group worked over many months with expert presentations and input and consultation from a wide variety of people in the industry and scientists and foresters, and they came back with recommendations that as a council we weren't ready to support. So our goal was really to take the work the biomass task group did and the underlying data and analysis that they had used and address the concerns and the gaps that the council had identified. I think much of that ended up being incorporated as questions, and the recommendation really, as a whole is, let's find answers to all the questions we raised as our next step. And I will hand it over to my colleagues from there.
That was a great summary. Thanks, Bram. Kelly, and then David, and I see Julie as well. Any other, again, if there's nothing else to say, don't worry about it. Let's go to Q&A, but Kelly, David, Julie, other things to say?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think there were a couple of things. I think the biggest takeaway that we heard from a lot of counselors when we discussed the biomass recommendations as presented by the original task group was that the language kind of presupposed the answers that would come out of the study. It said do a study, and then there were things about it that assumed a certain outcome from the study. So I think one of our biggest things to do was just take one step back and say, as Bram said, here are a lot of questions. We want these questions answered. And to give a very clear directive of what kind of questions need to be answered and how to go about that. So I think there was one other thing that I was thinking about. Oh, the other thing that when we had our conversation at our previous council meeting, I walked away from it feeling a little bit more confused about everything and what data was presented and things like that. And so one of my requests as we were going through this was to have citations and an easy way for folks to access some of the data to review it on your own. If that was something that you also felt walking away from that, if you're as confused as I was, I thought other people might like to be able to access that data. So we tried to add citations and links and things to help anyone reviewing this document understand where the statements are coming from, where the questions are coming from, and be able to feel confident that they have enough background to say yes or no about this document.
Thanks, Kelly. And I'll just note that one of the things that's linked in this document is what I'm dropping in the chat now, which is a summary that we put together of all the presentations that were made to the biomass task group. And it's an easy linkable summary, so you can click on the video recording and it tells you what time period to go if you want to see a certain presentation. So we encourage all counselors as well to use that document as a way of getting some more visibility. David and Julie, and any other things to add before we jump into some Q&A?
I would just stress that most items that were in the report that came out of the initial subcommittee are still in this report. We have, through the work of this group, sort of changed the tone, and what were presented as sort of complete statements were changed into questions, because there really wasn't the documentation to underwrite assertions that were in the original version. But the concerns, the issues that everybody wanted addressed are still incorporated in this version.
Thanks, David.
I have nothing further to add. Thanks, David.
Super. Okay. So what I was thinking is, let's do, if counselors have questions about the document or about something that's in the document, let's do a round of that. If folks have some suggestions about how to make this document better, then let's do that. All right. But questions, things that occurred to you when you looked through this document, let's start there. And so I'll just invite counselors. What did you think when you read this? How well did it capture what you think were the concerns that you all expressed earlier in the year? TJ, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I have a number of suggestions, but I'll hold those until after. One question I have is that the intro to the document is really broad in talking about biomass as a whole, and kind of, without restriction. It could, as I read it, it could apply to electricity use or thermal use or other use. And then the recommendations are really focused on, the study for existing biomass recommendations, biomass facilities, electric generating biomass facilities, and then, the second recommendations about new ones, new electric generation. And so my question is, just how did this working group and committee kind of take that breadth of really great work? What I meant to start with is, like, this is great, taking like all those meetings and distilling it into something really accessible. And I think the study is actually going to be really useful when it gets done. But, how do we think about kind of biomass for non-electric generating, which the first part of the document seems to get to, and then as separate from for electric generating?
Thanks, TJ. Folks in the task group, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Most of the interest in the first document and in the discussion at the board meeting and in our discussions was focused on electricity. Nobody talked about burning wood to heat your home. All right. And that was simply not part of the discussion that I was aware of. Don't forget, I came into this late. But I just wasn't aware that that was ever part of the charge to that committee.
Yeah. And that's certainly the way I understood it too, in helping to guide the committee. So I wonder, TJ, if it ends up being something about the intro, of trying to narrow that intro a little bit to focus on the what really was the discussion in the group.
Yeah, thank you. So I was part of maybe the first 2 or 3 of the task group recommendations, and I know there was a lot of discussion about the scope of that ask. And so having had to have dropped out just because of bandwidth of that group, I wasn't sure if it did narrow its focus or if it was a broader ask where we're looking at wood use for thermal purposes as well. So that, thank you for that clarification.
Other questions, reflections? And again, I don't want to inhibit if folks have some, so your question is fundamentally about a suggestion to change, that's okay too, but I'd rather do a round of sort of comments and questions initially. Joey?
Well, just sort of building off of what TJ was saying, there's been a huge amount of work and thought and really good thought and input going into this process. And this is a distillation, but the scoping question is one that I also had. But my question is also, in these recommendations, it speaks to the state conducting an evidence-based study that incorporates these various things. I mean, most of those things make a lot of sense to me, but the question, for me is, well, what's the next step in that process? Who is the state? And, you know, what sort of process then we would envision pursuing. So it really opens up to me. There's good content here. A lot of work has been done. More work needs to be done to answer the questions raised in this draft, but it leads me to a process question.
Right. And specifically, Joyce, I understand it's a process questions around what's in that document. Who is actually going to take that up? Who's taking that and running with it? It's not, is that the question?
Yeah, or if it's an open question, is that something that we're intended to help answer? Or if that's something that, Julie, I see you raised your hand, maybe you have thoughts on that. I'm sure you do. I'd welcome, it just strikes me as a process question. I'm not sure who's answering it.
I can take a stab at it. I mean, I think this is part of the larger conversation around budget and priorities. Obviously, we have benefited over the last several years as a council with commitments of one-time funding in the governor's budget that were ultimately supported by the legislature, which is what we have used to do these studies. I think the challenge in this working group is this is one study. It's got a fairly broad scope. But we don't have that similar articulation of other priorities the council may have as we look at producing an updated climate plan for 2025, and that's going to all factor into there and will ultimately need to be reconsidered when we come back post legislative session and understand what the budget looks like. The money in our FY24 budget is essentially spoken for at this point, so this would be an FY25 initiative.
Thanks, Secretary Moore. Okay. Other thoughts? I think there's two threads here that I want to make sure we don't lose. One thread is about scope and are we all on the same page what this scope is? And if there's questions about that broader scope of, say, for heating your home conversation, like what is the pathway on that? So that's one question of scope. The other is this question of sort of who therefore runs with this? How does this actually happen going forward? So those are two threads I don't want to lose. Paula?
Thank you. I have some questions and suggestions that are a little more detailed, but I just wanted to say I'm super impressed with, I feel like a lot of the questions people were asking at our meeting in, what was it, June? I don't remember. But I feel like they're reflected very well here, and it's very like well reasoned, and yeah, I think the way it's framed, like the way the questions are framed is really good, and it's asking good questions about things like, you know, are we just going to be like sending biomass to New Hampshire or whatever instead of burning it here? Like that doesn't actually help anything, right? So appreciate that a lot.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks for the feedback. David?
As part of our deliberations, we in fact asked about resources, took a look at what had been set aside, both in terms of your time, not you personally, David, but your corporate time, and other resources available to be able to complete this work. And after having done that, we never actually took a position. Oh yeah, this money's all here and we'll be able to do this. But we went ahead and published the report anyhow, knowing the resources available. And it's sort of not an absolute, but we did review resources available to the council to do this work.
Thanks, David. Yeah. Okay, other reactions, or if folks have some suggestions, I think a couple of TJ and Paula, you both mentioned you have some suggestions of improvements. So I'd be certainly open to those if folks want to chime in and say, these are ways this document could be made better. So those kinds of reflections and or other feedback from counselors. TJ, yeah, jump in.
Sure. So I am just a little bit concerned about the second suggestion or second recommendation. And the reason is kind of procedural. You know, apart from what I mean, what I think about the result is to be determined, but the second recommendation calls for the state to not support new electric generation biomass facilities. And I'm worried that that puts the state, you know, at least the Department of Public Service, as it's in its advocacy role before the Public Utility Commission in siting proceedings. We have you know, statutory obligations to review certificate of public good proposals and consider all of the benefits and harms to Vermont and make a recommendation as to whether this is in, you know, a project is in the general good of the state. And I worry that this recommendation here is, you know, well, is in conflict with what our statutory obligations would be under such a review. And so by, you know, having this recommendation here, we would almost automatically be countering this recommendation by doing our statutory work and actually reviewing the full project on its merits. And I don't think, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this recommendation would carry any would carry much weight in a Public Utility Commission process. It doesn't have kind of substantial deference, or there's no kind of legal terms that come with the Climate Council recommendation on this type of thing. And I worry that if a project were to be proposed, and this is not like a hypothetical thing, there's been discussion about two small biomass facilities in Vermont, you know, like 2 megawatt size recently, although no CPG filings. You know, I worry that this type of thing would compromise that kind of statutory review. And I want to be clear and want counselors to be clear that this is kind of a, you know, what type of meaning this would take in a proceeding. And I also don't want to feel like we're compromising a position here or a recommendation of the council to kind of take things under consideration under in that process. And so I'll stop there. I do have a suggestion of language that could work, but I'll stop there and look forward to discussion on it.
TJ, that's really interesting. I wonder actually if you might say what that language would be. I think that might be helpful in the discussion, like what language would address that concern you're expressing.
That would be helpful. I agree.
Yeah, let me just put it in the chat. So my italics and such didn't stay in the cut and paste here. But so I'll just, the new language kind of adds some text. So it's the state should not support new electric led generation biomass facilities in Vermont. And this is the added text without reviewing the implications of the project's relative benefits and harms that are described above or otherwise identified. And then while the state is completing this study, is the original language. The second sentence added the words, well, the council will reevaluate the role of biomass use for electric generation to focus it on electric generation consistent with the rest of the document.
Thanks, TJ. That's helpful to see what would address the concern. Bram, is your hand up on this? Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
You know, I think my feeling, which I think is shared with the people who worked on this, is that TJ, the public review won't be able to do its statutory consideration of harms and benefits to the state until the study is completed. You know, that's part of what we are going to learn, what the harms and benefits will be. And so without those answers, I mean, it seems perfectly consistent to me that public review would, public approval of new biomass would wait until we have those answers so that the review can include a full view of the harms and benefits and make a fully informed decision.
Right. And given that, Bram, when you think about that and you look at the language TJ put in the text, and again, we're not approving anything right now. I'm just curious, Bram, when you look at that, are you feeling like that's addressing what you're saying? Are you feeling that language isn't addressing what you're saying, Bram?
No, I think it is suggesting that review of benefits and harms can happen in the meantime. And it just feels like, I mean, yes, our current understanding of benefits and harms can be reviewed in the meantime, but we will have a much fuller understanding of those things when the study is done. So, I'd sort of say, unless there's sort of an urgent public need for new generation that says, we with our incomplete information that we have right now, we can live with the risk because we have this urgent need, that I would stick to holding on new biomass electric generation until we have learned, we've answered all the questions that we wanted to answer about it.
Thanks, Bram. That's helpful clarification. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I just first want to own that I didn't check that recommendation with the department as we were working on it. I appreciate the point TJ's raising here, and the department has a statutory obligation. A recommendation from the Climate Council does not carry the same weight. And I don't think we have the ability to determine the urgency of the need for new generation. There's a framework that allows applicants to bring those cases forward to the PUC. And I hear what TJ's saying, that it does put the department in a somewhat awkward position, absent the study being completed. And it's a study that's not really entirely within the control of the executive branch, even, in that it will require an appropriation from the legislature in order to conduct. So I would be supportive of some language softening. Either it could be a recommendation of the Climate Council. It may not be one that the executive branch members are able to support, given the statutory obligations of the department, or the softening that TJ's proposed in his alternative language, which would give place additional emphasis on looking at relative benefits and harms. But those terms, and I think it's important to be clear, aren't the terms of how the department is asked to evaluate proposals or weigh in on behalf of the ratepayers of Vermont. And so we're creating a different test, and that's also a complicating factor here. I think it's the right frame for the council to bring to this work. I'm just saying I don't know that it's an equivalent frame, Bram, which seemed to be what you could have been suggesting, and therefore would allow the department to continue to fulfill its statutory mandate.
Okay. Thanks, Julie. David?
In terms of softening the language, the council recommends the state should not support new electric generation. There's no authority vested in the council. There's a difference between should, shall, may, must, might. And we could go down those helping verbs and see which one would fit best. But that we make it clear that this is a recommendation or a suggestion to the process of reviewing until we finish this study.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's another option. TJ?
Yeah, thanks. And, I appreciate that what Bram and David you're saying. And the reason I wanted to propose this other language is so that I think the language I proposed could have meaning in the council providing guidance to the department in what it reviews. And it reviews kind of all the issues that are talked about in the study, you know, to the extent we can on the, in the, in a proceeding. You know, we may not have perfect information. We have to make decisions on imperfect information all the time and recommendations all the time. And so, so it gives us kind of, I think it actually is more meaningful for the council to do this than to kind of basically put a stay, an indeterminate amount of stay, or recommend a stay on this type of generation, where I would find it hard in my review to even account for such a recommendation, because I have to account for what I need to do by statute. And so I want to make sure, you know, it's ultra clear that if the council ultimately voted for the recommendation as is, I really would have a hard time putting meaning behind it, because we just have to comply with statute and make a recommendation with the information we have.
Thanks, TJ. Yeah. Joey?
Well, a couple different thoughts. It may be that the council does make a recommendation that is different, and I appreciate and understand what you're saying, TJ and Secretary Moore. That being said, I have a question for TJ. For me, I feel like in large part, this question has sort of been asked and answered. Doesn't the comprehensive energy plan sort of point directionally moving away from large scale electric-led biomass, and acknowledges the need for thermal applications for ensuing projects? It feels like to me, the comprehensive energy plan is also a statutory mandate, and I haven't dusted it off in a while. Sorry, TJ. I know it's a big body of work, but I thought that question has been asked for many years, and there was an assessment of electric-led biomass generation. Let's move away from it. Can you shed a little light, TJ?
Not off the top of my head on that specifically, but I can say that the energy plan provides a framework for decision making. And so, you know, I think there's a difference between actively promoting a project and when a project comes up for consideration. You know, when private capital is proposed to be used to develop a project in Vermont, I think we need to, we can't say, yeah, but do a CHP, invest your money this way or invest it somewhere else. We have to say, is this project, given kind of all of the harms and benefits of it, in the public good, and evaluate it in that manner. So even, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks. Kelly and Joey, if you had some follow-up, just let me know.
I just
Wait.
had a
Yeah.
follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Kelly. Well, just that I appreciate that, TJ, but I do think as an advisory entity, I think we could inform that process by saying that our view is that no new large-scale electric-led biomass facilities. So anyway, we just may have a different recommendation. So.
Okay. And Joey, it's interesting you introduced the word large scale, which is not in the document.
Yeah,
right
that was
now.
another
And
thing.
I don't know
was
if that you meant to do
curious
that on
about.
purpose.
Well, this is where I was hoping to lean into TJ's understanding of the CEP. I think there, you had started earlier, David, talking about, or the working group didn't tackle, home heating systems at the scale. So there's a difference. So I just trying to grapple with that difference in scale too.
Okay. Thanks, Joey. Kelly?
So I was wondering if we added, kept the state should not support new electric-led generation biomass facilities in Vermont, period. And then add to TJ's copy there something that at the beginning of that next little bit that says, if the state chooses to consider new electric-led generation biomass facilities, they should review the implications of the project. So basically making it a new statement, like saying, if the state does choose to consider these, they should also consider all these implications that are outlined in this. So does that make sense the way I said that? I could type it out.
Yeah. Right. So you keep the sort of,
help.
the council recommends, don't do it. As the state's reviewing these things, you should be reviewing the following stuff that we've listed above. Something like that.
Right. Yeah. To have the intention of the biomass recommendations as they were written, but also understanding that the state may sort of be in a weird place where they can't do that based on other statute. So sort of acknowledging that, but saying, but if you do this, I think that was TJ's intention also, like hold us to these standards as well as the other ones that are already in statute.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. David?
We're touching on a central issue, that this is an advisory group. We don't make rules, we don't make law, and our recommendations need to go to the administration so that they can exercise whatever powers they already hold, or to the legislature to create or amend existing powers in the interest of climate change. And the notion that we would say, and I'm backing on the very language that we brought forward for discussion today. But after this discussion with the group, the state should not support. We can't say that. We recommend that the state not support biomass during the time period. It's the state, as every responsible state employee here has said, has to implement the law. And that's what they're required to do. So I don't know that we can do very much more than recommend or suggest.
Thanks, David. Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like we have a good amount of input on this issue, and I wonder if we take this back and maybe this same writing group can try to distill this down into an option 1, option 2, or something along those lines for you all to then make a decision on the next time. Thanks, TJ, for bringing this up. And Julie,
David,
go ahead.
I guess I would be interested, I think Kelly's proposal sort of met the needs here and would prefer not to take it back and continue to work on it if we can reach resolution. I would defer to TJ, but I don't have any objections to the way she phrased it. I think it's consistent with sort of the concerns that have been raised and gives us a fairly easy path forward right now.
Right. So again, Kelly's recommendation is you have both things. Say the council recommends no new biomass while the study's being done. If the state is reviewing possible projects, it should review along the lines of the issues that are brought up in this document, something along those lines. TJ, does that seem to address your concerns in the way that Julie says it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that sounds like a likely path forward. And certainly if folks object strongly to sort of trying that pathway when you look at this next, now's a great time to shout out. Otherwise, I want to make sure we have some time for any other issues that folks wanted to bring up about the document. But before I jump to that, are there any sort of like screaming concerns in people's minds when you hear the way Kelly talked about it and that possibility of doing that, Richard?
No screaming concerns. I think Kelly's suggestion is a good one. I also would sort of make 2 notes. I think the distinction between large scale like electricity-led biomass and some other kinds of biomass projects might end up being an important distinction. And therefore, this is a reason why Kelly's language works for me. I'd also note that the list of harms and benefits is highly likely to be taken up in any review process at the PUC for any electricity project, particularly a biomass project. And so I think what we're recommending is not very different from what Section 248 already requires the department and the PUC and the agency to do in any certification application. But I think it's quite useful for the council to be clear about what we're recommending. And so I'm speaking up for Kelly's suggestion and for the document.
Thanks, Richard. Great. Okay. Any other issues? I think it was Paula, you had some suggestions, or someone else. But if anybody else has suggestions about what would make this a better document, go ahead, Paula. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so some of my questions are a little more niggly than others, I guess. But one concern that I have is that there are some sort of foregone conclusions embedded in some of the benefits and harms statements. So for example of benefits to Vermont, number 3 says, and it is hedged by saying may in some cases, but it says may allow the landowners to maintain the forested land as forest. And I just hear that like as such a logging industry kind of catchphrase. And I don't know that the industry has kind of like backed up that assertion with any kind of data that like, you know, we have to keep forests as forests, because like the money you get from forestry is not particularly comparable to the amount you could get by selling your land to a developer. So, I mean, I'm not sure that is like the prime reason people keep their land as forest. And so I just wanted to like maybe tone that down a little bit, or just suggest rethinking it a little. And then, so number 5 is a little bit similar because it doesn't, I don't know what the standard is that that biomass harvesting has to meet. I don't know like what's required and whether it's robust and enforced. And I guess I wouldn't want to include this in there without having a little more knowledge about like what that program is, what standard has to be met, and is it being met. So I guess the other one, yeah, I guess those two maybe we could talk about a little bit first.
Yep.
Those kind of 2 embedded sort of foregone conclusions.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. And I think I'd be interested to hear from the writing group folks as well. And, you know, certainly there was an effort to hedge, as you said, Paolo, right? That, with words like may and right. And so if it's not hitting that hedge robustly enough, let's figure out if there's language to do that. Kelly?
I appreciate you bringing that up, because I had actually at some point requested that we have a citation for what responsible forest use standards means. Let's see, what does that actually mean for the layperson, and how strong is the requirement? And I think that just didn't make it in the final draft. So I apologize for missing that when I said, yeah, it looks good. So I would reiterate my request from previous conversations of the task group that we have some sort of citation there. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly.
If I might, I would suggest that in answer to that question, that you look at the acceptable management practices the little orange book, if you will, in terms of what loggers, responsible loggers, must do in terms of working in the forest. The thing about those standards under current Vermont law are voluntary, except if you are a biomass facility, and then they are required. Okay, so that was sort of the distinction that we put in law when Rygate was coming online. I can't quote or refer you where in the green books that language appears, but maybe someone else can. But in the meantime, the acceptable management practices is a widely distributed, I'm sure it's online, in the Forest Parks and Recreation website.
Thanks, David. Julie?
Yeah, just there are harvest standards specific to the chips that are part of the certificates of public good issued by the Public Utilities Commission for both of these projects. I can try to locate those, but they are held to a much higher standard than other timber harvest activities. David's point included that they're required to comply with the accepted management practices. And then on top of that, there are some additional conditions around wildlife and biodiversity that apply specifically to chip harvest, and have biologists from the Fish and Wildlife Department engaged in the review of proposed timber operations to support these chip facilities when they're done in Vermont. Another important point about the AMPs is they are a component of folks who will participate in the use value appraisal program, which is the tax relief provided to Vermonters who keep forested lands and forests. And then just one final point, Paula, you'd asked about sort of the economic viability question. I think that I don't see that as a point that's made by loggers and foresters. I think that's a reflection that economically there are much higher value opportunities for landowners to pursue, and it's trying to make sure these lands remain economically viable. And we have work done by the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation that I can share with you that speaks to some of those economic viability challenges. But the use value appraisal program, in addition to having sort of markets for your wood products, are both integral components to that economic viability evaluation the department has taken up previously, and I'll share those around.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Great. Okay. Anything more to say on that, or other issues that people want to bring up? So what I hear from Paula is, let's be careful about the language and make sure we're appropriately hitting the hedge. If there's citations like what was discussed about right now that would be helpful to explain issues, let's get those citations in there a little more strongly. Other things that folks want to bring up, TJ?
Yeah, thank you, Paula, for bringing up that harvesting and responsible forest use standards. That was going to be one of mine. So, on the flip side, and apologies if I missed it while I was scouring the energy plan quickly to remind myself, didn't find what I needed to. Is in the harms, and in the harms it says it may impact the forest ecosystem through the removal of trees, treetops, and branches, and kind of similar to the some of the benefits. I'm not sure that that's always a harm. It could be a benefit in certain situations. I think there's people on this call that'll know the answer to that better than me, but I just wanted to flag that one as well as one to consider kind of some of that bi-directional language.
And I'll say that is why, again, we thought we were being careful enough saying may impact, and in fact, which I think implies and may not impact. So listing as a possible harm, not a definite one.
Yeah. Kelly, then Paula?
You have a good point there, though, because not all impacts are negative impacts. So I think we could just add the word negatively impact, or say may have a negative impact on, and that would clear that up for me. I don't know how others feel.
Paula?
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, so I think that would be a good idea, but also TJ, is part of what you're saying is that there's kind of like a resilience benefit to kind of cleaning up some of those, less, I don't know, less likely to be hit by wildfire and pests if we're managing the forest more carefully. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, those types of things.
Yeah.
It's not really my area of expertise,
Yeah.
but I know that there's some potential benefits. Yeah.
Right. So I was just wondering if it would make sense to also add it as a potential benefit. That particular impact.
Okay. Great. Anything else folks want to share before we do a round of public comment? Okay. Paula, is that a new one? Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
I'm really sorry. I have two other small things. Well, one of them is big, one is small. The small one is under the recommendations, number 1, and then the first set of bullets, and then the first bullet under that. What would be the likely sources of electricity that would provide a similar electricity profile? So I feel like it would make sense to, like, I think in that comprehensive energy plan, like it actually says like what is the capacity right now that we have for biomass. And I think like putting a little perspective in there would be helpful. Like it's actually not very much that would need to be replaced. So it's probably, we don't need to blow it out of proportion. It's really more about like, do we need to have a whole bunch of biomass mega plants in the future? And then the only other, I know that this must have been really hard to write, but the example of harms number 1 emits meaningful amounts of CO2. It just seems so vague. And I know that like the study is supposed to be settling that question of like, well, how much are we talking about? And what's the whatever the 100-year problem versus the 25-year problem or whatever, but I feel like something a little more specific could happen there. That's it.
Right. Perhaps citing some of the presentations and other things that were made to the biomass task group, for instance. Okay. Thanks, Paula. And I just want to make sure I got the first thing you said there about recommendation number 1 in the first bullet under that. Your suggestion is add in how much it is today just to give a flavor of the proportionality of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. And like just, because it's not a lot of megawatts compared to other sources that we're getting, and many of which are already imported. So.
Okay, thanks. Kelly, then Bram.
I have a comment based on that, Paula. One of the things that we were talking about when we drafted this, why we chose to use the word energy profile, is that it's not just the amount of energy that is created by these plants, but the fact that they are something you can switch on and off very easily. And so they provide grid stability. So if we phased those out and all we had was wind and solar, we'd have a problem with grid stability. So I think that was the implication of energy profile, not quantity, but the type of energy.
Okay, so it's kind of used as a peaker plant.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they're always used that way, but that's a thing that they can do that we can't do with solar and wind and certain other renewables. So I think that was the intention. Others can chime in if that doesn't seem.
Yeah, it was that's base power as opposed to intermittent power, which is what we would get from hydro and wind.
Right. Okay, great. Bram?
And you know, just to comment on emits meaningful amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, I think we could certainly quantify that as well, both in terms of tons of CO2 and percentage of Vermont's total CO2 emissions, if that would be helpful. I think that the point of that was, you know, simply to, you know, we tried to collect the sort of general categories of benefits and harms, which we heard both from the biotask work group and from the public in terms of the things people were concerned about losing if we phase it out, and the things that people were concerned about having if we kept it. And you know, it was simply meant to be an acknowledgement that this is a CO2 producing source of electricity versus non-CO2 producing as a harm. And you know, as Kelly said, on the benefits side, it produces power at the moment you need it, and can be used that way. So just wanting to acknowledge both of those, that they are simultaneously true.
Thanks, Bram. Okay. Anything else? And then I'll go straight into public comment here. But before I do, just anything else, counselors? Okay. Great. So we're going to do a period. I have about 15 minutes on the agenda for public comment, and then we're going to circle back and have a final set of reflections of the council, and then take a break. I see hands going up. Thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and do it. Annette, you had your hand up first. And as always, it's great to introduce yourself as you do your public comment. Annette, go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm Annette Smith, Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I have a couple of comments. One is that I note that some key counselors are absent today, including the co-chair of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, Abby Course, and also Lauren Oates. And also Judy Dow is not present. And these people collectively probably put more time and energy into the work that went into the recommendations of both the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and the Biomass Task Group. So I'm concerned about the decision-making process that is going forward. And I certainly would have loved to hear their comments today. And my guess is that they all have other obligations. So I will note that is missing. The other thing that I found missing from the report that essentially saying do another report kind of reminds me of the tobacco industry saying, oh, we just need more studies, which is a way of kicking the can down the road, is that it was mentioned at last week's ISO New England Consumer Liaison Group by the ratepayer advocate for New Hampshire, the independent ratepayer advocate, which we don't have in Vermont, that they have chosen not to continue to support the Berlin biomass plant because of the subsidies. And that is supported by the Republican government to cut those subsidies. I would like to see this Climate Council ask for an accounting of the subsidies that have been received for the Reigate and McNeil plant in Burlington over the life of the project, and how many subsidies these plants are seeking now. This is a piece of public information that does not have to be part of kicking the can down the road, but would be very worthwhile in establishing some basis for the operating plants. And I will note that they are both seeking to expand and in different ways, and claiming to be using the waste heat. And those are all going to be requiring public monies to subsidize those expansions. And nowhere in this do I see anybody talking about what the cost to ratepayers is. So thank you very much. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks very much. Cheryl Joy, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm Cheryl Joy Lipton, and I'm an ecologist. I live in Chester, Vermont, and I've been attending meetings from the beginning of the Climate Council, and actually had wanted to be a part of it, but my request to join was lost and not put into the mix for people to choose from. I am going to go a little bit backwards from what I wrote a statement to tell you, but I also want to comment on some of the discussion points that you all had. So negative impacts to forests. There are no positive impacts at all to forests in any management whatsoever, in any logging or management whatsoever, except for the removal of invasive species. And depending on how you do that. Cleaning up the forest is not healthy. This is my area of expertise. And Lauren Oates would probably be able to speak more on that if she were here. The only positive impact on taking anything out of a forest with regard to anything, climate or biodiversity or anything, the only positive impact is economic to the foresters and the wood products industry, and minutely to the homeowners, the landowners. So that is okay. Additionally, wood burning for heat versus electricity, this was also requested to be addressed by the recommendations that were rejected by the council from the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee of November 12th, 2021. And they say to address the use of biomass for thermal heat generation as well. That is part of it. And the biomass task group also said, and I put that in the chat, I'm sure I probably wasn't supposed to, but they also said that they wanted to have heat addressed as well in the use of biomass because of the impacts that they were seeing from burning wood. Commenting on the accounting for wood being burned for both electricity or heat, people are, the state of Vermont is officially not looking at biogenically derived carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. Let's see. One of the comments that somebody had on process and who does the studies. Well, there is, and then, I don't know if it was Julie Moore or somebody saying that the studies were going to be post 24, FY 2025 initiative. This is too much time. Biodiversity loss and climate change marches on. And as we all see, we're moving way too slowly and not doing enough. And we're playing with numbers. Let me use a good phrase that I've heard over the years, fuzzy math, right? This is crazy what's going on. You can't just on paper do something and then say that that's what's going on. It's not actually going on. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and when you burn wood, that's what you get, and it goes up into the air. It's not magically replaced. It is up there, and if you didn't burn it, it wouldn't be up there. All right, I'm gonna just tell you what I had prepared to say, because giving you the details is unnecessary. You can look at all of the things, all of the conversations in the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee meetings, which were recorded. You can look at all of the meetings in the Biomass Task Group. You can ask me to send you studies and to send you data, and I can do that. So I'm not going to really talk about any of the proof, any of the scientific fact, because it's not being taken. You're not listening to it. Okay. It is completely mind-boggling to me and many people that you are even considering the continuation of burning wood. The trajectory of climate change and the trajectory of the biodiversity crisis plummeting and species disappearing daily should make you shudder, should make you recommend real action, not more studies, not kicking the can down the road. Two groups that are a part of this council or formed by this council, however you want to call them, deliberated and said to phase out biomass burning. Ag and Eco, November 12th, 2021, that you rejected. And Jared, those recommendations are there and you can see them. So don't tell me that they didn't recommend phasing it out. They did. Numerous experts and numerous studies show that burning wood should stop. And that's what led to the recommendations that those two groups did. Keeping status quo and increasing it with the way Vermont is encouraging switching to pellet furnaces for all the municipal buildings and all of the schools and advanced wood heating being encouraged by everybody. Wood heating is making climate change worse. Wood electricity generation is making climate change worse and making the biodiversity crisis worse. It is plain to see that industry is in charge of the Vermont Climate Council. Wood burning and the state of Vermont. Wood burning is worse than burning coal. And we all know this. And you can do whatever you want with your numbers, and it's not going to change the fact. There should be a just transition. Economics matters. There should be a just transition away from burning wood for the people working in that industry. But it does need to stop. And it's just like the coal industry, and it's just like the fossil fuel industry. But actually it's not, because it's worse. This is cultural here, and you all need to wake up and smell the coffee, smell the wood burning. It's cultural, and we need to step away from it. If you continue to allow biomass burning and biofuels, liquid biofuels, it truly shows what a joke this whole thing is. What a joke the Vermont Climate Council is, and the legislature. It is really ridiculous, and a lot of people know it. And as they learn that
Point of order, Mr.
realize-
Chairman.
All right.
That
Yeah.
type of
So
language is inappropriate in a public meeting.
I'm almost finished.
David, hang on a second. David, look, I'm not worried about the language. I am, Cheryl, I just want to make sure you leave time for others.
I have three sentences left. This sounds really harsh, but you are rejecting science here, and I'm very upset. I didn't start out this way, as many of you can remember, because I've been coming since the very beginning of the Vermont Climate Council in the earliest meetings, and when I wanted to be a part of this process as well. But your actions and the conversation has led me to this and led me to my opinions on what's going on here. More studies are not needed. And as a matter of fact, the recommendations from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee said to use existing studies. And now there are 2 more years worth of more studies that you can refer to. Action is needed here to stop burning wood and work on a just transition. That's what we have to do. You guys,
Carol,
by the way,
I need
were
to
used to
give
endorse
others.
the Advanced Heating Act. I mean, the Affordable Heating Act. And I hope you all know it, because you didn't endorse it. I have comments on revisions as well. If there's time afterwards, I'd like to be able to give them, and I'll stop talking now, but I do have actual comments on the revisions of your revision.
Okay. Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, I think let's have some other folks. And I just want to be conscious of time so that everybody who wants to speak gets a chance. Typically, I would do a time limit. I didn't do that here. So I'll ask for your help in that so we make sure others get a chance to speak. Ashley, you're up next. Ashley Adams.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. And if folks are in a position to turn their camera on, you're more than welcome to.
Thank you. I'll leave mine off if you don't mind. I live in Burlington, and I appreciate you taking my comments, and I hope you will take everyone's comments today. If you follow the news, you're as alarmed as I am about the climate chaos impacting millions of souls around the world, thanks to our callous, multi-decade failure to take action. Climate and ecological collapse is happening right now, and the window of opportunity for doing something about it is slamming shut. And that is why the dithering in Vermont around biomass combustion is so maddening to those of us who've been watching. So I'd like to offer some reminders as well as some points of concern. There's no reason to relearn what the Public Service Board already knew back in 2014 when it rejected the proposed Springfield biomass plant, concluding that the project would undermine Vermont's ability to meet statutory goals for reducing greenhouse gases, quote, as a result of the large annual releases of greenhouse gases that result from combustion of wood fuel, unquote. We cannot get away with burning trees to generate electricity and still meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. Sustainable forestry practices do not change this fact. Per the IPCC, quote, green pathway, we need steeper, faster emissions reductions and increased forest growth for carbon drawdown. This is why 800 climate scientists signed a letter in 2021 to President Biden and other world leaders urging them to, quote, not undermine both climate goals and the world's biodiversity by shifting from burning fossil fuels to burning trees to generate energy. The overwhelming evidence makes it clear that the unequivocal recommendation from this council should be to entirely phase out biomass electricity generation in Vermont. Of course, there will be impacts to Vermont's forest economy, and there absolutely must be a just transition for all workers who rely upon our biomass plants. No one denies this. Several of the benefit examples are tenuous at best in your recommendations. And they're often thrown out there by folks like Burlington Electric with absolutely no credible data to back them up. And I heard them repeated by Julie Moore today. And I'm so disappointed to see them presented as assumed benefits. And thank you so much to Councillor Melton for rightly pointing this out at this meeting today. I'm really concerned about who will be conducting the evidence-based study that's being called for, where the data will be coming from. Will it include carbon emissions from combustion, for example, as it should? The state of Vermont lacks all credibility in this regard. I will also note that biomass is being phased out across the Northeast because it undermines climate goals. New York 2019 climate law removed biomass from the state's definition of renewable energy. Massachusetts 2022 removed woody biomass from its renewable portfolio standard. Connecticut began phasing down RECs for biomass plants in 2022. New Hampshire ended subsidies for 6 biomass plants in 2019. Governor Sununu said these biomass plants cost us $2 billion in subsidies since the 1970s. Why should Vermonters continue to subsidize our 2 biomass plants? How much has this cost us over the last several decades? How much will it continue to cost? Why isn't this among the questions being asked by this council? Why would we continue to subsidize climate and ecological collapse? Thank you for taking my comments.
Thank you, Ashley. Pike Porter, and then I also have someone who contacted me, couldn't raise their hand, and we'll jump to that person as well.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I'd like to start by just looking at the proposed district energy system that McNeil and Burlington Electric is proposing to show you an example of the GREET model and how it fails to account for carbon emissions. VGS commissioned a study that suggests that the DES, District Energy System, will displace 13,000 tons of carbon dioxide from natural gas, but it fails to account for the 32,000 tons of CO2 that it will emit by burning additional wood at McNeil. I'm worried that if you continue to do additional studies, this administration is going to continue to move forward with projects that don't count the CO2 emissions at the stack. 10 years ago now, 10 VSA 582G required the state to count all emissions, biogenic emissions, as well as fossil emissions, and they continue to ignore to do so. The ERG consultants that are doing the life cycle analysis work for the Climate Council is using the GREET model, which excludes the combustion of woody biomass and CO2 accounting. The DPS recently put out a request for proposals that suggest that it too is not going to count woody biomass in the Affordable Heat Affordable Heat Act accounting. The studies have been done, and it's clear that woody biomass is not good for the climate. Burning woody biomass is not good for the climate. And we don't need the additional studies. We need to move quickly. Another study is going to be another year out, and it's going to allow the administration to pursue this policy of burning wood, and it's got to end. Thank you.
Thanks, Pike. Appreciate it. Phil Merrick, you wanted to say something. Feel free to unmute yourself. And yep,
Yeah.
there you go. I see you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha.
Good. You know, I have to agree with, you know, Pike and Ashley and the others. But I'm just going to talk about a few specific things in this particular document. I wanted to get to Paula's questions, especially. First of all, you have 5 benefits. You know, I look at these 5 benefits, none of them are climate benefits, and this is the Climate Council. So as a member of the public, I'm a little curious. Number 3, though, which does suggest a climate benefit. To give you a little bit of scale, for every $25,000 spent by BED for biomass, $800 goes to the landowner. I was on a cut recently as part of a BED field trip, and I asked the forester how much money the biomass at that site actually absorbed or actually cost, actually paid the landowner, and it was $800. We're keeping people on their land with $800. This was, I think it was about a 35-acre cut out of about 150 acres that this landowner had. And so over the course of a couple of decades, they're going to get $2,000 or $3,000. I'm sorry, but number 3 is just absolute garbage. Anyways, in terms of the number one the number one issue in terms of real biomass impacts, the significant amounts of CO2. So to give you an example, Paula, in the city of Burlington, the McNeil plant produces more CO2 at the stack than all of the cars and furnaces and trucks and buses in the city of Burlington. And for it, we get enough electricity to run our refrigerators and our lights. That's the significance of the amount that we're talking about. And, you know, when we talk about some of these others, number 5, the acceptable management practices, none of these acceptable management practices were written with the climate in mind. So just remember that. They're acceptable practices for maintaining lumber production, pulp production, all of that stuff. And I get it. I've been on these cuts. And actually, the BED cuts are as good as you get if you want to cut down your forest. So there you go. Those are my comments for today. There's a lot more, but I know you guys have a lot to do. So I'll wish you a good day and thank you so much for doing the hard work.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate the comments. I want to check if there are other members of the public who would like to say something who haven't had a chance to say something. Okay. Okay. And I just want to check, I see a hand up from Peter's phone. Peter, if you want to go ahead. And Melody, I see what I think was an attempt to raise your hand. Give me 1 second. But Peter, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Peter Duval. And I wrote the Burlington District Energy Proposal in 1992 and also participated in Public Service Board docket 5611, which investigated environmental externalities. The question that I think must be answered is, how did the Department of Public Service go from being clearly opposed to biomass to thinking that biomass is zero emission? And I just want to read to you from draft 7 of the environmental externalities rule. That's from May 5th, 1993. This is page 14. Qualified renewable resources will exclude non-sustainable, they're specific about this, open loop yield biomass, conventionally fired biomass, and hydroelectricity. And McNeil and Rygate would be excluded on both of those counts, both being open loop biomass systems and being conventionally fired. So the question that I think should be on everybody's mind is, how did the Department of Public Service go from being staunchly opposed to considering biomass as a renewable resource to thinking that burning down the trees is a good idea? It happens sometime between 1993 and 2023. When did that happen, and how did that happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Melody Reed.
Hi there.
Hi.
I would just like to mention that, climate change aside, there are 59,000 some odd people living in Vermont with asthma. I'm one of them. My son is one of them. My daughter-in-law is one of them. And we have a rough time in the wintertime with all the wood burning that goes on. And so I just hope that you all would keep those folks in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Okay. I'm not seeing additional hands or expressions trying to people to get in. What I'd like to do is take the next up until the next 10-15 minutes just to have any reflections folks want, and then we definitely need a break to come back. But let me just say quickly, prior to the public comment, I was taking some notes, and my notes are very raw. I might even share them with you right now. But just so you know, we're capturing what you said earlier, right? Which is the scope question came up, and how this group was looking at the electricity scope, not other, but the top doesn't sound like that. We had some public comment around that. There's questions about the process next step, and what actually happens. There were comments about overall it's looking good. Then we had this long conversation about the second recommendation, and we settled into, you can ignore all this, we settled into something that feels like a pathway forward there with Kelly's suggestion. Then we had some conversations about sort of any foregone conclusions that could be implied from the benefits and harms. We have some specific thoughts about that, about how to better hedge or better cite or otherwise address concerns about that. So that's what I had in my my raw notes before public comment. And then we just had a bunch of public comment that provided additional thoughts. Counselors, when you hear the public comment, when you think about your conversation before we jumped into it, are there other things that need to be said or questions that are raised for you that you want to make sure we say prior to whatever next step we want to do on this? Again, we're not making a decision today, but we want to raise up the things that are of interest to you all and are concerning to you all, so that when you do make a decision in your next meeting, we've previewed what those issues are. Any reflections having heard that public comment? Things you want to say to finish up this conversation? Okay. So in terms of next steps, oh, Joey, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I do want to just go on the record that I would like us to point in the direction of, as an advisory body, of no new large scale electric led biomass facilities, just point blank. And I am eager to look through these in more detail and consider the public comment, and encourage people who sort of case made in the public comment to send the sort of citations of what they were referring to. That would be very helpful. And my question is more about process, before I sort of to you, David, in terms of thinking through all of this. What are the next steps for the next meeting, and final deliberation on these recommendations and next steps?
Yeah, I had the same question, Joey. So I don't know. What do folks think about next steps on this? Would you like your writing group to go back and, based on everything we just heard, and put together a new document that you would deliberate on in your next meeting and make a decision on? Would you like a different process? I am certainly open to thoughts. TJ?
I have a different comment.
Oh, you're going a different direction. Okay. Can you hang on 1 second? I'm just interested in the next steps piece that Joey brought up. Just pushing this back to the group to take these notes, to take what was heard, and come up with another, a revision here to look at in your next meeting. Does that seem like the right approach? Any concerns with that approach? Well, I'm not hearing concern.
I'm sorry, David, with the intent of bringing it to the next full council meeting for a formal vote. I mean, is that still the timeline that we're working on?
Yes.
Okay, so if it does go back to committee, there's no assumption that it's going to delay action by the full council.
No. Nope. The idea is just having something on which to make a decision at your next meeting. That would reflect the comments you heard today from yourselves, and reflect what you heard from the public comment. Okay. All right, so let's do that as our approach, unless someone else has a better idea on process. TJ, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, David. I just wanted to reflect on the comments, and maybe because I'm sitting in for Commissioner Tierney, I take the opportunity to speak on this. Well, I very much appreciate all the public comment that we got. It is very, it's really good to hear your voices on these issues. And there's, it strikes me that there's a lot of times that we're all talking past each other and not kind of on the same, and that just kind of creates like this escalation of conflict in the issues. But with regard to greenhouse gases from biomass, I think they're, folks are right. You burn, you combust the wood, and carbon goes into the atmosphere. But when I think about that in relationship to the Global Warming Solutions Act, rightly or wrongly, the GWSA set targets and requirements based on the greenhouse gas inventory as it was in place a few years ago when that law was passed. And so we have legal requirements to meet those targets. And so it strikes me that the conversation is ultimately bigger, that we almost need to revisit what the targets are, because if we measure our progress and we kind of change how we're accounting for greenhouse gases, which may be the right thing to do, then we need to go back and change the baseline. Because when the legislature considered the Global Warming Solutions Act, and I was not involved in kind of those negotiations, but it strikes me that they're considering the balance of, okay, if we reduce, if we meet these targets, it's going to have the economic implications for the state, it's going to have the climate implications, it's going to have, all these different implications. But if one thing I worry about is changing kind of the targets and not going back and creating a kind of a empirical data issue where we're comparing one thing to another. And I might have all this wrong, but it seems like if we say, okay, well, we have all these more emissions from biomass or from whatever, if you count everything life cycle, right? And then we have to make reductions based on that. We're putting a different burden, maybe worthwhile, maybe not, but a different burden on Vermonters than we intended to. And did we mean to make that decision? And so I just wanted to reflect on that. Maybe that's not worth a lot right here, but the main thing is that I think all the comments really kind of bring that sort of thing to light in my mind. And I just want to appreciate the comments we heard, and to just raise that for council members and for the public. Like we got to make sure we're talking the same language and comparing the impacts to Vermonters, using kind of the same comparison. Otherwise, we're never going to get on the same page or get close to the same page enough to like talk about the issues coherently. So thank you.
Thanks, TJ. Bram.
Before we leave this conversation, I did want to acknowledge and thank all the people who joined this meeting and who commented. And, I want to say that I hear your frustration and hear and feel the growing panic over the fact that our planet is burning down. I do not want you to think that we are in any way not hearing you and not sharing what you feel. And we are what you see in the document is a desire to ensure that shutting down Vermont's, the original recommendation was shut down Vermont's biomass plants. And we want to understand fully the implications of leaving them open and the implications of closing them, so that we as a state, as a community, can make a fully informed decision that does not have unintended consequences. And the CO2 emissions and the health of the forests are all important. And it is also true, as I think Paula said early on, that if shutting down our biomass plants means that the forests in New Hampshire and in New York and in Quebec simply get cut at a higher rate to provide biomass, we haven't changed anything, other than perhaps improving our air quality and the health of people at ground level in our neighborhoods at the expense of people living elsewhere, which, is contrary to our goal of providing a just transition. Having our benefited electricity cause health harms elsewhere is a move away from justice. So I don't know how old any of you are, but I remember when I was 17, I knew everything. I knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, and what was smart and what was stupid. and it was as clear as day. And unfortunately, that clarity fades as one gets older, and one realizes that things are not simple and clear. And the value of having people with perfect certainty is important to the discussion, and the value of people who see that there are things that are not perfectly clear or simple is also valuable.
Thanks, Bram. Joey, Kelly, Chase has his hand up as well. I'll jump there in a second. Conscious of time, just a few concluding thoughts.
I'll defer to others, and if we have time, I will wrap, but
Okay.
Kelly and Chase.
Thanks. Kelly, go ahead.
Thanks. First of all, yes, I thank you so much for everyone who commented from the public. I really appreciate it. And as someone who struggled with how to draft this, I share a lot of your same concerns, and just also really appreciate coming and listening in and sharing your thoughts. There's the one thing that keeps coming into my mind about this is that it's not easy. It's really complicated to measure emissions and emission reductions and all of those things. What's even harder and more complex than that is measuring our resilience. And there's not an easy number that you can put on resilience, right? And unfortunately, we often don't know if we're resilient until something happens, like a huge natural disaster, and we find out which places were resilient to in crazy rainfall and flooding and which ones weren't. I wish it weren't that way, and hopefully we can have better foresight as we know that things are going to get worse before they get better, no matter how fast we reduce our emissions. And one thing about using wood for energy of heat or electricity is that it's something we can produce here. We don't get fossil fuels from Vermont. We're going to run out of fossil fuels anyway as a planet. And so that potential for resilience by not completely throwing out all burning of wood is something that I just wanted to lift up, because we're going to need to be able to support ourselves and deal with potential major issues in our economy and our connectedness as crazy weather events happen and other things that might disrupt our ability to live the lives that we have gotten used to. So just a word out there for resilience as something we need to focus on in addition to emissions reduction.
Thanks, Kelly. Chase, you're on the Just Transitions subcommittee. Thanks for chiming in, and then let's take a break.
Yeah, thank you. I am not a Vermont Climate Council member, but I am on the Just Transition subcommittee, and I was. Can you all see me? I've been having.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, and I was also on the task group that worked on the biomass recommendations originally. So like many folks who were on that, spend many hours working on and thinking through this topic. So I would just like to say thank you for considering the topic, but just offer a few thoughts. First, in response to TJ's point about getting on the same page about greenhouse gas emissions accounting, I would just note that Section 10 VSA 582G has been on the books for over a decade. It has not been implemented, but it does call for the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting of biomass in particular. So when we're talking about getting on the same page, I just would note that the legislature had already said that we should be looking at wood biomass emissions, and it said so a long time ago. We just haven't done it yet. Bram, my recollection is not that the report said that we need to end biomass. My recollection was that it said that we should study a responsible phase down of wood biomass and then the responsible phase up of electricities to replace it, so that there would be a plan. Typically in considerations of electricity generator retirement, that's, I think, the type of contemplation that goes into it, a careful studied, responsible plan. It wasn't a cliff that would, you know, that folks would, the state would fall off of. Then I would also, on the topic of the study time, I guess I would note that, as I think I heard Secretary Morse say, the budget would not allow the report to proceed until 2025, which means we probably wouldn't get a report until 2026 or perhaps later. And I just would note something that we heard in the public comments, that across the region and also across the country, wood biomass electricity generation is in decline. And I just note that because if we do delay thinking about making a plan for what to do with wood biomass electricity generation in the state for years from now, it may be that that decision ultimately is made for us by the market. If the states, for example, that we sell renewable energy credits into, like Connecticut, cease accepting them, we may not have much of a choice about how we phase out wood biomass. That choice may be then thrust upon us, where we're in a situation of whether we need to retire all of those renewable energy credits here, for example, in the state, and pay that difference, or some other alternative. Markets being what they are, policy changes across the region being what they are, I guess I would just say that delaying multiple years to think through the very same topics that were already thought through over the previous year and a half, that would, I think, look to the very same studies and the very same experts who were already consulted. It's a little hard to see how that will best serve Vermonters who pay for electricity and who would be stuck holding the bag if the state did not actually have a plan when other states stop wanting to buy renewable energy credits from us. So I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to offer those insights, given that I was on the task group and given that I think a few things could just benefit from those clarifications. So thank you.
Thanks, Chase. Okay. All right. So we definitely need a break. My understanding right now is that all of this input, we can take it back to that writing group, come up with a new version of this draft that reflects the sentiment of the counselor input you heard, tries to digest a lot of this public input, and come back with something that you can deliberate and decide on in your next meeting. All right. So that's the next step on this. You saw we've been taking some pretty detailed notes on this, so we can have some instruction for that writing group to go do this work. All right, so it's top of the hour. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back 10 minutes past the hour, and we'll get into our work planning conversation. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. This was a long piece. We'll see you in about 10 minutes. If you're here, thanks. Let me know if you're here by putting your camera back on as a counselor, or saying you're here in the chat. So let me see if there's a critical mass. We'll get back going. Okay, I'm seeing some, but I would love to see a few more before we get going. Thanks, TJ. Okay. All right, so why don't we get going? The next piece we wanted to do is around some sort of high-level look at work planning for you all, the council, going forward. And then we want to make sure we save enough time for review of the governance document. So let's not get too bogged down in the work planning. You can see in this document, it's maybe I'll drop it right in the chat. You can see it. So this document is something that the steering committee looked at, and it's a starting place, I think, is the best way to describe it. And I know Jane and Jared and I, on behalf of the steering committee, did an initial whack, and the steering committee looked at it. And I think you can see from the document some basic ideas that are in here in terms of the initial bullet points, and then this sort of step-by-step kind of view at the second half of the document, and I'm happy to share it in a sec. Before I get into it, I wonder if steering committee members, and maybe Jared in particular, because you and I and Jane sort of started this process, you want to say a little bit about the spirit of it and sort of what sort of the overall logic is about why it's important to do this work planning now and what the thought is. Jared, maybe if you want to say a word about that.
Sure. Thanks, David. So I think broadly, we were trying to do two things at once. One is to work backward from the next charge responsibility that was given to us in the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is to deliver a revised climate action plan by July of 2025. And so thinking about what worked well, what could have been improved on from the process that led to the creation of the initial climate action plan. What do we need to be preparing now in terms of process, in terms of public engagement, and what do we need to be preparing in terms of research and analysis and contract analysis to have ready on the timeline to be able to produce the cap revisions by July of 2025. So that was the kind of working backwards context. I think there was also a working forwards context, knowing that there were some unfinished parts of our work from, that are ongoing now. That includes this biomass conversation that was just had. It potentially includes further work on the gap with regard to transportation recommendations. And there is ongoing analysis that is happening that is relevant to both the first climate action plan and potential revisions. So I think really what we're trying to do is make sure that we are fully planning ahead so that we can have both the process and the information at hand when we need it to be at hand, so that we can confidently produce a really high quality cap revision that builds on the good work from last time, but that also tries to avoid some of the time compressions that happened in the first process. And that really means that there's a number of things that we need to begin focusing on as far away as July of 2025 sounds, that we really need to begin focusing on this fall and over the winter.
Thanks, Jared. Great. So that was what I heard as well, and from the steering committee side of things. So our purpose today is to look at this and provide some initial input on this sketch. However, there are some shorter term things that may require you all as a council to be a little more pointed in your reactions to. And I'll particularly point you towards this document that has a part that says shorter term work that complements the sort of the longer term vision that Jared was saying of getting the plan update right. There's a number of bullets in the shorter term work that speak to things that are happening right away. And let me just point them out for a second, because I think we shouldn't finish this conversation without talking about these a little bit as well. There is a specific request, and it's in your email, and perhaps someone like Jane or somebody could say a little bit more about it. But there's a specific request from the legislature asking for the council's assistance in identifying priorities for resilience and adaptation policy for the next legislative session, which obviously is a tighter time frame than your plan update. And so, you know, as a steering committee, the steering committee looked at some ideas of like, how do we do that and also not lose the focus on what we really want to do, which is update the plan. And there was a suggestion here, again, this is in suggestion mode, that the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee could meet this fall. The state is working up its priorities based on, particularly on the flooding and other things. And the subcommittee could sit with the state agencies, look at what the state's doing, consider if there's other things that you as a council would want to talk about. And then when you meet later this year, you could review whatever that subcommittee came up with and act on that. So this is the kind of thing where it's like a short-term issue, a request from the legislature, how to not get distracted from the bigger process, but also provide some meaningful input now. The addendums we've talked about, we've got biomass. Transportation is a question mark here, and we can talk about that today, about whether what's been done so far from a transportation addendum is going to be sufficient to carry you through to the 2025 revision, or whether there's more to be done there. And then this is the piece, and I'll need Jane to say a little bit more about this. This is where the Climate Action Office and ANR is working hard behind the scenes around how to access federal funds. This is specifically on emissions reductions. So this is only about emissions reductions, not about resilience adaptation. And there may be opportunities to hold some sort of webinar type thing or other type of activity with you as a council to get the council's input on this. Okay, so that's shorter term work. I want to make sure for sure we talk about that today. And if there's some guidance that you as a council want to say about your time and how to do this, let's capture that. Okay, let me stop sharing and remind you. So in addition to this top bullet about plan revision, down below, there's some sort of steps around what might need to happen this fall, what needs to happen early next year, what needs to happen in the June to December, second half of next year, and into Jan 2025 to get up to July. So again, that's some initial sketches of what might be a best use of your time in a sequence. Let me pause and say, for those of you who had a chance to review this document, are there things jumping out at you that you want to reflect on to help make it better? Are there questions you have about what's in that document when you think about the use of your time in the coming weeks, months, years? Reactions to what's being proposed? Rich?
I think that a lot of what's being proposed is, very sensible and appropriate, and I especially appreciate the shorter term actions that are listed there. But I'd like to reflect a little bit on an additional short term or interim set of actions that I think are sort of part of our ongoing responsibility. I judge that the GWSA envisions an ongoing relationship between the council and state government, especially the ANR. And I want to launch this conversation with an emphasis on collaboration. I personally believe that we need to collaborate across the council, including the legislatively appointed members and the administration members, and I hope that the rest of the council feels the same way. The statute gives obviously a great deal of authority and responsibility to the ANR. but it also gives this council a substantial role. And I'd like to extend a little bit on what David Dean said a little while ago, that we are advisory, but there's a strong advisory role and a weaker advisory role. And I think the legislature has given us a stronger advisory role. In addition to our responsibility to develop the climate action plan, and we obviously need to prepare to develop the next one, we are required to advise the secretary on plan implementation. Section 593 and Section 591 state that the secretary shall follow the Climate Council's guidance on the form and content and subject matter of the rules that the agency needs to create in order to implement the plan. With respect to timing, the GWSA requires the agency to develop rules and to implement the plan with specific initiatives, actions, and strategies so as to meet the 2025 targets. Those rules initially were due last December. The rules also must be updated on or before July 1, 2024. And I'm quoting here from the statute, to ensure that the 2025 greenhouse gas emission reduction requirement is achieved. Obviously, we can't wait to create a plan in 2025 to meet the goals that are already mandated to be achieved by 2025. So, I mean, that has to do with work that we need to do to make sure that we're on track to implement the existing plan. So here's a request. It seems to me that as a first step, for the council to provide advice to the secretary so that the ANR can adopt or update rules by July 2024, which is what the statute says, we need to be briefed by the agency and perhaps by other agencies on two things. First, how's it going with respect to the rules already adopted? And how do they stack up against the 2025 requirements? And second, what additional rules or updates are agencies planning to adopt by July 2024 in order to meet the mandates? So what I'm suggesting is that it's a necessary part of our work planning for the coming year, that we ask the agencies to tell us where they are on the rules and initiatives so that we can consider whether we're on track to meet the 2025 and 2030 mandates, or whether additional initiatives or guidance from the council might be needed to implement the climate action plan that we've already adopted. So I just think we should build in a briefing from the agencies on where do we stand and what rules, what is the expected impact of the rules already adopted, and what additional rules are being planned, or I hope they're being planned, in order to make sure that we're going to meet the 2025 requirements. And I didn't see that in this document. I didn't see asking for that from the agencies as part of our work plan to do what we need to do in the coming, 8 or 9 months.
Thanks, Rich. Okay. All right. So a specific request to add into the document what you're saying, and add that as a step. Any quick friendly amendments or reactions to what Rich is saying? And unfortunately, Secretary Moore had to step away right now, which is unfortunate because she would probably have something interesting to say here.
Well, and it would be great to speak with her about it.
Yeah. and it's a crying shame she's not here right now. Okay. Peter Sterling?
Yeah, I just want to thank Rich for bringing this up, and I want to say I share his concerns. And I hope this council can move forward in enacting some kind of timeline or action plan to make sure this gets done on time.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Okay. Joey?
I think it's a really important point, Rich, and I would also appreciate that update and opportunity to understand what, what's underway that's been adding up. I mean, the agency, we did implement rules around advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks. People are aware that it's a big deal and it's going to add up significantly, but there's likely other rules or amendments that will be needed. So I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding where we're at, where we anticipate what we've done, getting us to where we need to go, and where we're falling short. So I just support what Rich was asking for. And then also just in general and sort of related is that there is a huge amount of work that has been going on, in the agencies. And I think it would be helpful, and maybe it's not as a climate council meeting, and if there's something I could do to help organize, because it's an idea that would take a little work, which is just to get some updates from the agency or agencies about some of the big buckets of work that are happening that would inform all of this, including what is happening with the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment, the timing of that. There's all kinds of different work underway, the measuring and assessing progress tool, the municipal vulnerability index. I know the B-Trans has been working on the carbon reduction strategy, and they're finalizing some initial meetings to get input on the draft plan. That's going to be a huge thing that will help inform the transportation component. All of this is to say is that it feels like we just need a little bit more understanding of what is exactly happening and some of that is reflected in this document and some of it's not. And Jane just said, I think it would be helpful to Jane's comment that you've committed to that. I think sooner rather than later to understand and inform work planning would be great. And if there's anything that I can do to help alleviate some of that burden, but my guess would be it would be just webinar updates that people could beam into. And to Rich's point about the sort of synergy between the council, the ANR, and the legislature, I think some of this stuff would be helpful to have the legislature have the opportunity to understand what's underway here, so that there is the needed synergy that we're looking to create here on some very complex issues. And I could lay out some of those more specific things too, in terms of shorter term things, but they're all, anyway, happy to do that if that's helpful.
Thanks, Joey. And I wonder, there's this moment laid out in this plan under like step 1 about focusing the work, where I can only imagine that works well if something like what you described happens then or has happened before, right? Where agencies are updating everybody about everything that's been done, the stuff that's underway, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder, Joey, if when you think about it, is what you're saying sort of part and parcel of that focusing the work thing that happens early next year? Or are you imagining sort of even this fall starting to get into a rhythm of this kind of information?
I would say sooner rather than later. I mean, the legislature is going to have some sort of resilience package. I mean, we need to focus on resilience. I think sooner rather than later, we're in our biomass conversation, the need for a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment to overlay, our existing inventory and where that falls short. This all feels very interconnected and important. And some of those things are in different sort of states of progress, but I would say sooner rather than later. And I don't want to lose the important thread that Rich laid out too, the sort of understanding what the rules we currently have add up to and what amendments to or new rules may need to be implemented to meet the letter of the law. So I think some of those updates would be helpful sooner rather than later.
And I'm looking at Paula's text in the chat about this would allow us to focus as well. So if things are well underway and in good shape, that doesn't need to be the focus of the update work. It allows you to prioritize your time. Okay. Leslie Ann, good to see you.
Likewise. Hi, David. Hi, everybody. So I had two pieces I wanted to just piggyback on in terms of the things we just mentioned. And one of them has to do with the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee and the work that is proposed in that. Happy to join in that conversation. And just recognizing and lifting up there are a number of folks on this call here who are also representing federal agencies who are particularly interested in assisting with anything that has to do with adaptation resilience, particularly coming out of the lessons learned that Peter raised earlier in this particular meeting, but also some of the things that they saw during the flooding events of July. So just wanted to make sure that that invitation to bring as many pieces of expertise to the table in that rural resilience and adaptation piece is on the table. And then the second thing I wanted to just kind of raise, going back to the Science and Data Subcommittee, and knowing that some of the things that we're learning in the last couple of years since the plan was adopted should be included, just to put a pin in revisiting some of the things that we know from like a climatology perspective as we rewrite the new plan to make sure we've got the most cutting edge science on the table as well.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. Other reactions here to what we're looking at? TJ?
Oh, well, this isn't another reaction. It's just kind of agreeing with Joey's comments and others just about an update. Just reflecting on a lot has happened in the last couple of years since the climate action plan was passed, and I think there has been a lot of good state work, and that when we did the initial climate action plan, one of the first things we did was to kind of take stock of where we were and in order to understand where we needed to go. And so I'll try and work with Jane in the Climate Action Office. Department has a big role in a lot of the things that are happening, and so for our part, we can present on some things. But it's also broader than the Climate Action Office, as Leslie Ann pointed out. Resilience and other subcommittees will have updates as well. So,
thanks, TJ. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I heard four things that are interrelated in that conversation. One was where we started the conversation about the specific issues around an update on the rulemaking aspect of this and a briefing about that in the council. You feel has a responsibility around that in the short term because of the July 2024 deadline on that. More generally, you're interested in briefings of all the work that's going on because a lot of work is going on, and that's going to shape your thinking. Sooner the better to start. There was a particular shout out to adaptation and resilience and making sure the different sources of knowledge and information are brought to bear from state, federal, other places. And finally, when we're thinking briefings and things like that, the state of the science on the climate and climatology and all that is different than what it was 2 years ago when you all were doing this or the council was doing this. So those are important things that we can weave into this. And the question that comes to my mind is sequencing and how you get that right. And also knowing that your time is not unlimited. So how do we prioritize, are thoughtful, and really trying to do a good sequence? All right. Jared.
Thanks, David. I appreciate everything that's been shared. I just wanted to pause to put a finer point on what I really heard from Rich, which is not just an update on activity that is underway or work that has happened since the last climate action plan was adopted, but very specifically knowing that there is this requirement, 10 VSA 593D, that the Secretary of ANR shall honor before July 1st, 2024, review and if necessary, update the rules required by subsection B of this section in order to ensure that the 2025 greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirement are achieved. And that references a part of the section that says implementing rules consistent with the specific initiatives, programs, and strategies set forth in the climate action plan to achieve the 2025 greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirement. And, you know, as I look back at the climate action plan, there are a number of recommendations that could be advanced via rulemaking. My understanding is that primarily the only ones that have been are Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks and the associated rulemaking under that package. But this is really important, not just from the context of our role of being able to be aware of what's happening, provide advice, but in terms of having eyes on what will be necessary to revise or propose in the next climate action plan, because we need to know which of those recommendations are going to be taken up to meet this legal obligation, because we know right now that the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rules are not sufficient to close the gap between the projected trajectory and the 2025 obligations. And we know that additional rules will be required to be implemented to close that gap and meet that legal obligation. So I just want to make sure that as we're talking about this, it's not a general update on work that has happened or that is ongoing. It is what is the rulemaking plan as required by statute to revise and adapt rules, put forward new rules consistent with the initial plan to make sure that we meet that 2025 obligation. That's something we very clearly need to know what is being planned, and that I think it's very clear is going to have to be new work because the existing rules that were advanced last year, we know are not sufficient to do that.
Thanks, Jared. It is sad that Julie's not here right now. Secretary Moore isn't here right now to be part of this conversation. I'm just noticing something dropped in the chat here from Jane about ANR having a different interpretation of what's being put forward here about that 2024 date. So, you know, I don't want to get into it right now because we don't have the right people to have that conversation, but I just want to flag that as something that will probably be part of the conversation going forward, is an interpretation of what that really means. What I'm hearing clearly from you all, Rich, Jared, everybody, is the specificity of what you'd like, which is that specificity around the rulemaking, in addition to the broader set of briefings and information that you're talking about. Okay. I want to make sure we have time to get into the governance document. So any other feedback on the work planning, this initial sketch? Okay. So we're going to take these notes back, and the steering committee really is the body that's charged with making sure the council is, you know, using its time wisely. And so the steering committee will take this back and probably put a more detailed plan together. And next time you all meet, you can look at that. Before we jump, I just want to circle back on this, these two pieces right here. Do folks have any concerns with using the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee as a vehicle to work through an initial round? Essentially, this is what I think, Joey, a little in Leslie Ann, what you're talking about of, like, we need to do a briefing on this and bring people together. And then if the subcommittee has some thoughts about a role for the council above and beyond what the agency work is already doing, you would have a chance later this year to look at that coming out of subcommittee. Any concerns about this? We just try to activate this process. Okay. Great. There's some, we can activate this process and circle back with you all. This as well, this is something that's going to be going on. There's a possibility of doing webinars, doing other things so that you have some visibility into how the Climate Action Office is doing its work around the federal money and the federal grants. Right. And it is true that there's a co-chair vacancy in rural resilience adaptation. And that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. Okay. All right. Governance. So this is a longish document, right? So it's a bit of a beast. However, it's had a lot of eyes on it in the steering committee, and we've done a couple rounds, and you'll see in the email that was sent out that you can look on the steering committee meeting links on the calendar. You can see how the versions adapted over time. If you are deeply interested in seeing how this document evolves with the steering committee's input over the last 3 months. The version that you have now is a version that the steering committee felt was in a good place to share with you. Today, our job is to review this document. If there are real-time vacancies, excuse me, real-time, I was just looking at the chat, real-time addendums or, revisions you'd like to make to this document, we can try to do those. And then finally, we need to make a decision today on it so that it becomes your guidepost for how to move forward. The email that you received has a little summary in it about the kinds of things that were worked on based on input from your March meeting in other places, right? So there was input on how do you make this document relevant for your ongoing role. Now that there is an initial climate action plan, what is your ongoing role? How do we clearly center this document in that? There's detail about how climate councils members talk about this work and represent or don't represent the council. There's a little bit more detail and change in the decision-making process and some other things like that that respond to the concerns that you all have raised. So I'll invite folks from the steering committee, if anybody wants to say a word about how you saw this revision process go forward, anything you want to say to frame up the conversation we're about to have. So I'd welcome steering committee members who want to say something about this work. So Liz and Bram and Kelly and others, Jared.
I'm happy to say something. Sure. I think you're right that it went through a number of revisions, both individually. We were able to send comments as well as have a couple of group chats about it during the actual steering committee meetings. And in general, I think those focused on the areas that your cover note indicated. I think there's other areas of importance, but a prime area that we discussed and modified was on the role of counselors and how to describe that, particularly when they either are asked to speak or are otherwise speaking about either their own work on the Climate Council or things the Climate Council itself has done. And so those are reflected in the draft, along with trying to pick up on a number of the process changes or practices that we made along the way, and clarifying for all of us, as well as for the public at large, how decisions are made on the council when at times consensus is not broadly reached, and in any event, decisions have to be recorded and understood in order for the council to do its work. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Liz. Other folks? Bram, I saw you were just about to jump in.
I've changed my mind.
Okay, that's great. No worries. Any other sort of opening thoughts from steering committee members? And then let's just open this up. Remember, our goal is to approve it today. So if you have some concerns, now is the time to work through them. Okay. Richard, yeah.
So generally, I just want to thank the steering committee. I think you all have done a good job. I have a comment and a request for a wording change. My comment goes to the topic we were just discussing a little while ago about the council's role in between creating plans, having to do with advising state government with respect to the process of implementation and checking to make sure that we're making progress towards the statutory mandates. And I don't need a big, section to be added to this document in order to address that point. But if you look on page 9, where we're talking about addendums, we're making the point here that addendums or addenda to the plan will be, limited to deal with unforeseen circumstances, and that's fine, because it states that this must be balanced with the need to focus on implementation between plan periods. And I just want to draw attention to those words, that we are expecting to focus on implementation, which is fine. But if you go to the top of the next page, there's just one wording change I would request. The sentence says, if addendums including recommendations that speak to rulemaking, if addendums include recommendations that speak to rulemaking, these rules will be considered on the schedule for rulemaking defined in the GWSA, which is 1 year from plan adoption. We've just been through a discussion about how the rulemakings required for 2024 are in addition to the 1 year requirement in December 2022. So I would just delete the phrase, which is 1 year from plan adoption.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Again, feeling Julie's absence right now. Okay, other reactions to the document, things you want to shout out? It's okay to shout out and say, I read it, I feel comfortable with it. That's a perfectly fine reaction too. But if there's things that are calling your attention like it did to Rich, now's the time, folks.
David, if it's okay, so this is Jared. I hadn't actually, I'm reading this sentence in a different way now than I had previously. And what I mean by this sentence is the same bullet point that Rich is talking about that is on the top of page 10.
Yeah.
To me, that at least as much of a concern would be that second sentence that begins as such and reads, as such, if a rule is recommended in an interim period between plan updates, rules would be advanced on the schedule which coincides with the next plan iteration. That language isn't entirely clear to me, but I could see it being interpreted in a way that if there were rules that were being advanced in 2024, the council would not be able to speak to them until the next plan is passed and or adopted, and that seems problematic to me. So I think it's probably safer just to delete that whole second sentence that begins as such and ends with plan iteration. So that we don't get into a situation where we cannot follow our statutory obligations of rulemaking proceeding between plans and the council being able to deliberate on what the implications of that are for the implementation success of an existing climate action plan.
Okay. Thanks, Jared. Rich and then Liz.
Yeah, and I'll take that as a friendly amendment to my suggestion. I agree with Jared that the language creates confusion. And I would delete that final sentence as well.
Okay.
Let's just say, if we're speaking to rulemaking, these rules will be considered on the schedule for rulemaking defined in the GWSA, period.
Okay. Okay. Liz and then Secretary Clauser.
Yeah, I agree with what Kelly just said in the chat, and believe that it also gives room for what Jane indicated in her comment if we just put a period after GWSA. So to the extent Julie isn't here, that also seems like a fair edit that doesn't change what could have been intended.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Kristen?
I was just going to say the same thing. I think deleting the second sentence seems fine if that sentence is causing confusion for folks. And I just also wanted to point out that this is under a section that is speaking to addendums, right? So I think that is probably why this didn't jump out to us before. It's not talking about general rulemaking or within the GWSA, it's talking about addendums. And I think that's important, but certainly don't have, not wanting to speak to Julie, but I don't have a problem for Julie, but for myself, I certainly don't have a problem with deleting that second sentence.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Let me just let this sit for a second. And before we make a decision on that particular piece, I want to just test, are there other things we need to work on in this document? Are there anything else? Is there anything else we need to work on? And then we'll circle back and see if we're going to make some specific changes like that. Anything else folks need to put on the table in terms of things that aren't working for you? Okay. All right. I don't want to prematurely cut off this conversation, but I just want to note, like, that's a pretty successful outcome if that's truly the case. Thank you, steering committee, for guiding a good process. Okay. All right. So let's circle back to this change that's being suggested. And the suggestion is to turn the final bullet in the addendum section of this document to look like this instead of what it was. I already dropped it once in the chat of what it is, and this would be the suggestion of what it should be, if I got this right. If addendums include recommendations that speak to rulemaking, these rules will be considered on the schedule for rulemaking defined in the GWSA, period. And then you eliminate the clause, and then you eliminate the second sentence. And that's where the bullet would end. That's what I heard as the suggestion. Okay. We don't have Julie here. That's kind of a drag. I know she has opinions on this. But Secretary Clauser, this seems to address any concerns you would have. Does anybody have concerns with making this change in the document? Okay. So with no concerns raised, actually, hang on, stop. David Dean, go ahead, please.
I'm just looking for some clarification. When this section talks about rulemaking, is that a formal submission of a rule to the administrative procedure established under Title III? What's the definition of the word rule?
Could someone take a stab at that based on how you all in the GWSA has treated this, right? Because this is in the GWSA in the context of the council. Jane says yes. Rich?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I believe that is the intention of the GWSA when it refers to rulemaking.
Great.
So the Climate Action Plan was adopted by rule through the formal APA. Okay.
No, it It was not. It was adopted by the council by a vote of the council.
And
But
it
the makings
include
agency is that the various agencies may engage in to implement the climate action plan. Those rulemakings go through normal process.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. So with that clarification, again, any concerns with this specific change on that final bullet in the addendum section and tightening up that bullet to what you see in the text right now in the chat? Okay. Well, I'm not seeing concerns about that. So let's treat that as accepted as a change to the document. And I didn't hear other concerns raised prior to this when I asked if there were other areas of the document you want to work on. So let me just test right now. Is there anything else people want to work on before you sort of formally then adopt the whole document now with this one change? Anything else that needs to be worked on before you do that sort of procedural step right now? Okay. All right. So let me ask, and this I'm just going to do somewhat more formalized, but could folks put in the chat, Climate Council members, could you just put in the chat an answer to my question here of, do you agree to adopt this document with the change we just made as your process document for your work going forward? If you could just drop in the chat a yes or a no if you're a council member, it'd be great to have that memorialized here for us. And so I invite all counselors to do what I can see a bunch of folks are doing here. Okay. Great. Super. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Looks like we have a unanimous set of yeses there in the chat. That's fantastic. I want to create a final space here for public comment. And I particularly want to, if there is comment, I'd love to focus it on the things we just worked on, as opposed to pick up other threads. So that would be my encouragement of folks who would want to provide any additional comment. I'd love to have that focused around this governance document and the work plan. So let's create a space now for additional public comment, and then we'll close up the meeting. Annette, please go ahead.
Thank you. Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. My comments on the work plan discussion. So I'm wondering a couple of things. One is what the role of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee is, because I'm not seeing that subcommittee, which the co-chair has said in meetings, feels as though they have no real power or say. Whether that committee is going to find some relevance in this, and if so, how. My other comment has to do with the letter to the council from the speaker asking you to focus on resilience. Yet I'm having trouble merging that with the drumbeat of all we are mandated to do is emissions reductions. So shouldn't you be responding to the House Speaker and say, if you want us to focus on resilience, you need to change our mandate, which is something that Chris Campion had suggested numerous times when he was on the council. He said we could get our emissions to zero, and I'm still going to have to be dealing with all the flooding in southeastern Vermont. So I'm just having trouble merging those two concepts of I note that the speaker tied the resilience question to the climate action plan, but as this council keeps getting reminded, the only thing that you are charged with doing is reducing emissions. And I've said this before, and Chris Campany said it as a member of the council. Are you going to go back to the legislature and ask them to change the Global Warming Solutions Act so that there is some authority for doing that resilience work? Thank you. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate it. Cheryl Joy, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I actually only have a comment on resilience. And so if somebody else wants to talk about the other, I'll wait till the end when everybody else is done talking about that.
Yeah, I think now's as good a time as any, Cheryl, and then we'll do a round with final reflections and the counselors.
Okay, so with regard to resilience, I think, and I agree with what, just to bring it up, what Chris Campany previously said that Annette alluded to, and I agree with that. That's a really good idea to do that. So the more emphasis on reducing consumption would help in this, just to, even though that's not related to what we're talking about right now. But there, I find a lack of that. And to reducing logging, concerning this resilience, reducing logging by phasing out wood for burning for heat and electricity will increase resilience in many ways that I can, share with you, or another ecologist can tell you. And I believe that it would be really important to have ecology or landscape architects as well on board with this idea of resilience, because they're very, that's their field. So that's it.
Thanks, Cheryl Joy. Yeah. Anybody else who's been observing the meeting today want to comment, particularly on the work plan and the governance document? Okay. I'm not seeing, and I'm not getting pinged in chat. Okay. Counselors, this is a time to any final reflections on the work ahead. There are some sort of specific things in public comment just now from Annette and Cheryl Joy. If you want to reflect on any of those, now's a good time to do that before we close up today. Any final reflections about the work ahead, folks? Okay, I'm not hearing final reflections. Paula, were you about to jump off mute there for a second?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that when I joined, along with David Dean, it seemed like everybody was kind of in this burnout mode. And I struggled to kind of like find a way to become active. And I feel like things are ramping back up, and I feel like it's a good energy. That's all.
Excellent. Thanks, Paula. That's good to hear. Okay. All right. So next steps. Right now, our next scheduled meeting will be in December. There are things that will be happening between now and then. Not the least of which is several of your terms are expiring at the end of. Help me out here, Jane and others.
For the Senate appointees, it's October 22nd. And I can just provide an update that Kelly and I, as the two Senate appointed members or Committee on Committees appointed members, did send an email to the Senate Committee on Committees last week to inquire about the process for either seeking reappointment or for the opening of the appointment process and that timeline. And so we can share information when we receive it back. But we have reached out to inquire about that process already with the Lieutenant Governor, Senate President, and Senator Mazza.
Thanks, Jared. And I know when this was the House appointed folks, we ran into trouble because the way the appointments were written, you couldn't carry on until a replacement was named. You had to stop. Is that the same in the Senate? Same for the Senate? Okay. So it appears that that is the same. So that process is a process of the legislature. And so, you know, that's the venue in which to have influence over that process. Okay. So that's one thing that's going to happen that's important. So obviously getting appointments from the legislature will allow us to be, again, a full council or near full council in December. The short-term issues that were named in the work plan are things that the steering committee are going to need to start to make some progress on in the coming months. And I, as facilitator, can also help move some of that activity forward to make sure it's happening. And what else? And what will likely be happening is as we get towards the end of the year is the subcommittees are going to need to get revitalized and active and start planning for that focusing conversations that will happen in the beginning part of next year. So be prepared for that. And we will start to sort of swing into action with our subcommittees to start this process that was laid out in the work plan document. Okay, anything else on next steps that I'm missing or people were expecting to hear? Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for a particularly important meeting today. Cheryl, Joy, did you have one last thing? I know we're sort of out of public comment.
No, I have a question and I couldn't type fast enough.
Okay, quick.
What's next for the biomass situation? Is there another meeting? Are you going to not talk about this until December? Who do we talk to? And can we speak with people? Can we write to one person or the group? The website changed, etc.
I would so the process is what we talked about today, which is there'll be detailed notes from today's conversation. And then probably that same writing groups will get back together and figure out what could change in the document to reflect the comments today. And then that'll be posted ahead of the next time the council takes it up, which right now is in December. If you have comments on that, there is a pathway for commenting broadly to the council, and that's the best one to use. And I'll ask Jane if to make sure if there's been any change to that pathway to drop it in the chat right now. But it's through the website. And that's the best way because it comes to everybody. And we can share that around and make sure people see it.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
Sorry, I tuned out and only heard part of that for a second, but did you, there's an email, I can put that in the chat or Mary can keep on talking, but please I don't think the public comment, I believe the public comment portal has been taken down. If it hasn't, it is not being used. So
yes, it has been taken down. It's gone. Yeah. It's been gone for a while.
Yes, good. That's intentional. Thank you. And the email is the best way. And that email comes to both Marion and I, that general email. So please go ahead. And I would be doing a disservice to say that we also have a new community engagement and communications coordinator in the Climate Action Office who started today, Sophie, who will be thinking a lot about how we better engage with the public long term, especially as we ramp up to the climate action plan and the systems and processes in place to do that. So thank you.
Comment on the public comment portal being gone.
Yeah.
That's should be there still. And
okay.
For everybody to be able to see what everybody else is saying. I request it be put back.
Okay. All right, folks. Thanks, everyone. And we'll be in touch over planning for the next meeting. Thanks for your energy. There's work to be done. The subcommittees are going to start to kick into gear in the coming months. and appreciate all your time today. So we'll see you later. Thanks, everyone.
You.